Chances are, if you grew up in the West during the Cold War, or if you haven't specifically gone looking for information about it, you may never heard of the name Varyag. Well, maybe you have, and maybe it springs to mind that Wunderwaffe cruiser, also called the Varyag. But if we look back a little further, we find that it was the name of a cruiser from the Imperial Russian Navy that was actually built in Philadelphia and served as one of the exceptions, one of, to the rule of inadequacy and insane incompetency that was the Russian Navy at sea during the Russo-Japanese War. However, this story of the Russian Navy, and oh boy does it end in a wacky, horrific way with a lot of self-sacrifice and being sold out by the High Command, because it's, well, a story about the Russian Navy, it's worth visiting. So without further ado, let's wade into the story of the last stand of the cruiser Varyag. Varyag began life in October 1898 in the United States of America. Russia at the time was going through an intense period of fleet modification, and the domestic shipyards were full of new projects. And so, as with many of the contracts of the period, the order went out to tender, and the American yard won the contract. Varyag was actually named for the Varangian Guard, the famous elite shock infantry that served the Byzantine Empire during the medieval period, made up of warriors from both Scandinavia and the Kievan Rus. She would be launched barely a year later, on the 31st of October 1899, before being commissioned into the Imperial Russian Navy on the 2nd of January 1901. In typical Russian Navy fashion, the drama began before the ship even hit the water, as the ship's assistant physician Leo Alexandrov absconded from his crew, who had been sent as an advance party in preparation for the ship's commissioning on the 20th of April 1899. Alexandrov was actually ballsy enough to apply for US citizenship, but was arrested for desertion. His case actually reached the Supreme Court, and the ruling was known as Tucker versus Alexandrov, and it stated that although Varyag was yet accepted into Russian naval service, it was still a warship under the terms of the 1832 treaty between the two countries, and so his conviction and beatings that were about to come would stick. Upon commissioning, the ship was painted in white, gold, and black, with many commenting that they thought she was one of the most beautiful warships they had ever seen. Which, I mean, I see it. Varyag is gorgeous. The Varyag, though, did appear to be somewhat lacking for her intended role as a protected cruiser. See, Varyag was armed with a battery of 12 6-inch guns and single turret along her sides, which for the time was quite good, with an additional 12 3-inch guns, 8 1.9-inch guns, and 2 1.5-inch guns. On top of that, she also carried 6 15-inch torpedo tubes, with one in the bow, one in the stern, and 2 per side. All of this on a hull about 129.6 meters long and 15.8 meters wide. Now, this all sounds fantastic. She displaced approximately 6,500 tons, but her armor, it was very light. And I mean very light for her role. And to make matters worse, there were effectively no armor shields on the guns, and if there were armor shields on the guns, they were quite small and very thin to protect these gun crews from flash and shrapnel. The problems were further compounded when it was realised that the ship could actually only go 23 knots instead of the contracted 25. Now, it's only 2 knots, but that 2 knots makes a big difference. These drawbacks in design, however, seemed of little note to the Russian crew, who seemed to greatly admire their new ship. By all accounts, the ship was far more comfortable than the ones built back in the Imperial yards back in the Empire. Shock horror. Now, on that quickly, I'm referring to them as Russian sailors and Russian crew. They are not all Russian. Remember, the Russian Empire conquered and subjected many, many different nationalities and cultures. So there's Kazakhs, there's Ukrainians, Belarusians, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Uzbekis, Tajikis, Ulanu, just, I can keep going, there's a lot in there, but you get the gist. Anyway, in May 1901, the ship arrived back in the Empire at the Kronstadt Naval Base, you know, the one that the Reds blew up the sailors for rebelling after the sailors helped them, near the Russian capital city of St. Petersburg, and it attracted many visitors, including the royal family. The royal family and their retinue of courtiers were delighted with the ship. However, the mother of Tsar Nicholas II allegedly did know that the cruiser would likely not handle taking damage well, but the ship's crew did not seem to share the anxiety or worry. It's not like they would have to worry about a war where they were going. Varyag, shortly after her stay in Kronstadt, sailed for the Russian Far East, straight into the arms of destiny. The ship was then based in Port Arthur, in the Yellow Sea, at the time a Russian possession, and an all-important warm water port in the east. In December 1903, the cruiser was ordered to serve as a hospital ship in Chomulpo near Seoul in what is today South Korea, but to also stand by to defend the Russian embassy if the need arose. This was, for the time period, the norm, as the hospital ships, aka gunboat diplomats, for the British Empire, France and the United States, and Italy were also at the site. Now, at this critical juncture in history, the Varyag and its accompanying little gunboat, the Koreats, were ordered to support the embassy against any provocation due to the near-constant political struggle between the Japanese and the Russian empires for control over the Korean peninsula. This in part fueled by the fact that Tsar Nicholas II almost got killed in Japan and had a bit of a chip on his shoulder. The Russians, sensing that with the Chinese Empire falling back and breaking down under, well, a century of shame, they thought, well, it might be our turn to dominate the Far East. In reality, Varyag was being used as a pawn. She was isolated from the main fleet in Port Arthur, and being used seemingly as a hostage by the Tsar and the Naval Command. The reasoning was that if the Japanese attacked first, then Russia, well, it would be seen as the defender against a savage aggressor, who had no morality and honour to attack a peaceful vessel engaged in diplomatic endeavours. Because hey, it's just the lives of the sailors on board, and we all know how important human life is to the Russian government and high command. Isn't it funny how the more things change, the more they stay the same? The jig was up though, and Japan broke off all communications to the Russian Empire. The Varyag, commanded by Captain Visvold Rudnev, had to guess as best he could what the situation was in regard to the openness of the conflict because he had absolutely no idea what was going on. They did not know on board Varyag or Koreats that Japanese destroyers, for example, had attacked the fleet in Port Arthur. On the Japanese side, a powerful squadron formed up outside Chomulpo Bay under Rear Admiral Uryu Zotokochi, comprising of 6 cruisers, multiple torpedo boats, a smaller Viso, and 2,500 soldiers in their transports, appearing intent on landing. The protected cruiser Chiyoda had been based in Chomulpo for the last 10 months and kept a close eye on the Russian ships. On the 7th of February, the Sungari, a Russian transport, arrived and gave news to Captain Rudnev that the aforementioned Japanese fleet was approaching. Koreats was ordered to Port Arthur to get instruction and slipped out of Chomulpo on the 8th of February. Koreats, however, ran into Chiyoda just outside the port and mistook it for a Russian vessel. Only after closing in did the Russian crew realise their error and, in the ensuing confusion, fired its guns, which had been loaded as a salute for a friendly ship, putting on quite the display of fireworks. Interestingly, later on when the 2nd Pacific Squadron, yes, the Voyage of the Damned one, arrived at Tsushima to get its, well, back blown out, it too mistook Japanese ships for Russian warships. Should have gone to Specsavers. Chiyoda rapidly responded to this firework display with a torpedo launch, and although both sides missed, this was actually the first exchange of what would become the Russo-Japanese War. Koreats retreated rapidly into the safety of Chomulpo harbour, and it was by now too late to escape clearly, and Varyag and Koreats were effectively stranded and under siege. To this day, it is unclear who fired the first shot in this engagement, but that's of little importance because both sides were pretty set on slapping each other around. Later that morning, Chiyoda made contact with Rear Admiral Uryu and his fleet at the harbour entrance and reported the following ships were in the bay: HMS Talbot of the British Empire, USS Vicksburg, shockingly from the United States, Elba from Italy, and Pascal from France. The presence of foreign warships in the anchorage proved somewhat of a difficult situation for the Japanese admiral, because as intent as the Japanese were at removing the Russians from Chomulpo and, well, Korea in general, starting a war with the 3 of the 4 most powerful navies on Earth at the time was not exactly in the nation's best interest. This was not yet full send-it Japan, that comes a bit later in history. The Japanese admiral, knowing that his country was not able to single-handedly fight the entire world, a point seemingly that would be forgotten in about 40 years' time, sent a message to the captains of the foreign vessels asking if they would slightly move their ships away from the Russian warships that were effectively using them as meat shields, promising not to attack before 1600 hours that day, never mind the fact that it was completely illegal under international law to attack a ship, whether it be an enemy or not, whilst it was in a neutral port. It is still the Imperial Japanese Empire after all. Uryu ordered his cruisers Chiyoda, Takachio, and Asama, accompanied by various torpedo boats, to sail through the channel, accompanying the troop ships, in order to not delay any disembarkation of soldiers. Meanwhile, he left 3 cruisers, Naniwa, Nitaka, and Akashi, with 3 torpedo boats in the rear as a reserve force. By 1800, on the 8th of February, the troop ships had anchored in Chemulpo, right next to the Varyag, and they disembarked their soldiers. At 0300 the next morning, the offloading of soldiers was complete, and after a very tense 11 hours, all Japanese ships, save for Chiyoda, withdrew. Chiyoda delivered the following letter to the ships of each nation docked in the bay, including the Varyag. His Imperial Japanese Majesty's ship, Naniwa, Chemulpo Roadstead, February 8th, 1904. Sir, I have the honour to notify you that hostilities exist between the Empire of Japan and the Empire of Russia. At present, I shall attack the men of war of the government of Russia, stationed at present in the port of Chemulpo, with the force under my command. In case of the refusal of the Russian senior naval officer present at Chemulpo to my demand to leave the port of Chemulpo before noon on the 9th of February 1904, and I respectfully request you to keep away from the scene of action in the port, so that no danger from the action would come to the ship under your command. The above-mentioned attack will not take place before 4 o'clock p.m. on the 9th of February 1904, to give time to put into practice the above-mentioned requests. If there are any transports or merchant vessels of your nationality in the port of Chemulpo at present, I request you to communicate to them the above notification. I have the honour, sir, to be your most obedient servant, S. Uryu. A conference was called aboard HMS Talbot by Captain Rudnev, almost immediately after the respective captains of each ship had read the letter from Admiral Uryu. He said plainly that the Russian ships would have to fight their way out of the anchorage. The captains of the neutral warships in the bay attempted to advise the Russian commander that it would be more prudent to just surrender because, well, it was suicide. But Captain Rudnev was adamant that Varyag and Koretz would fight their way out of the trap they were in, probably knowing that if he surrendered, well, it wasn't long for this world when he got back to Russia. At noon, the captain of HMS Talbot, Dennis Bagley, made his way to Naniwa with a letter signed by all of the neutral captains in the anchorage, save for the captain of USS Vicksburg, stating that they would not move their anchorage, as Chemulpo was, as previously stated, a neutral port. Perhaps the refusal of the neutral ships to move was meant as a way to convince the Russian captain to keep his ships in port and hold out. If it was, then the effort was made in vain, because at 11 o'clock on the 9th of February, Captain Visvold Rudnev and his 2 ships made a break for it. The following account of the battle, as it should be noted, comes directly from the logbook of the Varyag, so it is completely from the Varyag's perspective. We're not looking at the Japanese perspective at all here. At 11:10 in the morning, all hands assembled on the deck of the Varyag as she headed out to sea with Koretz, approximately 1 cable length or 200 metres astern, with the British and Italian crews cheering for the Russian crew. On board Elba, the Italian band actually played the Russian national anthem, which at the time was called God Save the Tsar. At 11:25, the Russian crew goes to battle stations, with the Japanese cruisers forming a battle line in front of their supporting torpedo boats. It should be noted at the time the Varyag had spent a significant amount of time in that port, and so had the other warships, so they had quite friendly relations at the time. At 11:45, Varyag opened fire with the guns on her port side, responded to in kind 2 minutes later, with Asama responding with her much larger and more powerful 8-inch guns. This was followed straight away by the entire Japanese fleet opening fire. The Japanese fire was highly accurate, and one of the first shells managed to destroy the port wing of the bridge, setting a fire at the chart house and killing the junior navigation officer, along with immobilizing all of the crew effectively nearby the rangefinder. As Japanese fire continued, the guns along the Varyag began to be destroyed and damaged beyond immediate repair. At 12:05, after passing the traverse of Yoldoni Island, the Varyag was critically damaged when the rudder drive took a hit. At the same time, a shell hit the foremast and took out the bridge, and the ship's wheel, tearing through the bridge crew. The cruiser was ordered to steam full astern in the hope that she would be able to extend the range and get out of fire, but the damage to the rudder was just too much and it jammed. The Japanese cruisers closed in and tore the Varyag apart with rapid fire. The Varyag hit back, striking the Asama, which turned away and stopped firing, buying them a bit of time, but it really made no difference whatsoever. By 12:45, it was completely over. The Varyag was able to slowly limp back and dropped anchor near the British, French and Italian ships, who rendered aid to the wounded, while the remaining crew made their way to the Russian transport ship, the Sungari. Just as this was occurring, the captain of the Koretz blew the powder magazines on his ship, and very nearly showered the neutral warships who were conducting a medical operation, and the Sungari, which was evacuating sailors, with debris and shell fragments, because he didn't sail away to do it properly. The captains, naturally worried, begged Rudnev to not blow the Varyag up in the same manner, because it would blow their ships up. And, well, he agreed, not being an idiot and realising what was going on. It's really refreshing, isn't it, to talk about a Russian captain who's not completely stupid? The Varyag was scuttled and rolled over and sank at about 8:10, but crucially her hull remained intact. It was just a matter of opening the seacocks and letting the ship settle into the water. The Russian crew on the Sungari, fearing capture, actually just burned the Sungari, and they would later be repatriated back to Russia on neutral vessels. In all, 33 sailors had been killed on Varyag and 97 had been wounded. Both ships had been lost, and the Japanese, meanwhile, had barely been scratched. You would think this is the end for the Varyag, but this is actually just the beginning. After the war ended, Japan started to look around at the dozens of destroyed and surrendered Russian warships, and it began to realise that there was a fair chance it could put a few of them into service to help make up the numbers margin against other European powers. One of these ships was the pretty well-designed, protected cruiser that was sitting in the water in Chomulpo Harbour. The Japanese Navy set to work, and after a bit of effort they managed to raise the hull, which was, while damaged, in a pretty damn good condition. After some repairs, the ship was commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy as the Soya, named for the northernmost cape of Hokkaido, an area comically close to Russia. Soya would serve in the Imperial Japanese Navy as a general-purpose cruiser, not a frontline cruiser, but a bit of a jack-of-all-trades, masters-of-none cruiser. But also, crucially, her new role included the job as a training cruiser, and the whole point was to teach junior officers navigation and how to navigate long distances at sea. Remember, at the time there's no radar, and the ship would make annual voyages to Hawaii between 1909 and 1913. Interestingly enough, some of the officers trained on Varyag, now Soya, would later take part in the December 7th, 1941 raid on Pearl Harbor, navigating their way to the islands using lessons taken from the ship. That is the most useless trivia fact you'll ever know, but enjoy. As 1913 gave way to 1914, Russia and Japan would again find themselves at war, but this time as allies against the Central Powers. By this point though, the Soya, well, it was showing its age. And you know, she'd literally already been sunk once, so that does have an effect on a ship. The decision was therefore made in Japan to offer up for sale some of the warships captured from the Russians during the Russo-Japanese War. The Russians, in a twofold case of one being a little too obsessed with saving face, and two, desperately needing ships because it was getting pummeled by Germany, jumped at the chance, and it repurchased the old dreadnoughts Perezavet and Poltava, along with the ex-Soya, now again named Varyag, at Vladivostok on the 5th of April 1916. Interestingly, out of respect for the Varyag's last stand in combat, the Japanese never removed the name Varyag from the ship's hull, even though it was called Soya. In June that year, 1916, the ship departed from Murmansk via the Indian Ocean, where she arrived in 1916. Varyag, though, was not in the best of shape and was really showing her age, and so, after some celebrations, she was sent to Liverpool for overhaul by Camel Laird shipyards in February 1917. The idea being that she would be prepared to join the Russian Arctic Flotilla, but in October that year, crewmen aboard joined the October Revolution and hoisted the red flag, refusing to sail. Britain was having absolutely none of this revolution stuff. It was already dealing with enough problems. And so it sent soldiers aboard to seize the ship, which was then given to the Royal Navy to do with whatever it wanted. The new Russian government flat out refused to pay for the ship's refit, and in February 1918, while being towed to Ireland, the ship ran aground. Raised and then used as a hulk until 1919, the ship with absolutely no purpose whatsoever would be sold to a German firm in 1920 for scrapping. A seemingly ignominious end for a ship with such an interesting history. But the old Varyag had one more trick to pull, and on the 5th of February 1920, she ran aground on the rocks near the Scottish village of Leadenfoot in the Firth of Clyde. The decision was made to therefore scrap her in place from 1923 to 1925, and today there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever, save for the remains of the bell in St. Petersburg and the ship's ensign, which is actually on loan from South Korea to Russia, that the ship existed at all. The name Varyag actually caught on as a bit of legendary tradition in the Russian Imperial, but also the Soviet Navy, as another one of those heroic stands against the old story, the unbreakable spirit, yada yada yada, those things. There's even a song about it. In reality, the Varyag was sent alone with a small gunboat to a position effectively as bait. Bait to start a war that the Tsar cockily thought would just be a matter of firing a few shots and putting Japan to heel. The crew fought the Japanese as best they could. The captain fought as best he could as well. But like the 2nd Pacific Squadron to follow, they died for absolutely nothing more than the Imperial Tsar's quest for glory through military conquest. Which I suppose at the end of the day, I guess it really does make sense that this is one of the legends that the Russian Navy likes to follow. Today, there's a new Varyag. Well, newish, there's actually been a couple. The one today is one of the very old Slava-class cruisers, and it is the sister to the Ukrainian cultural heritage site Moskva. The Russian Navy actually tried to get her into the Black Sea in late 2022, early 2023, but due to treaties surrounding the Bosphorus, they couldn't actually get her into the war zone. The modern Varyag's original name, though, was Shavona Ukraina, and it spent its days bobbing about the Pacific Ocean, one of only now 2 Slava-class cruisers. Interestingly enough, before that there was another Varyag. It was the aircraft carrier Varyag, sister to the Admiral Kuznetsov, and it is now, after being towed halfway around the world, in Chinese service as Lianglong. Thank you all for joining me for another fun little episode of Misery at Sea, aka known as the history of the Russian Navy. Like, comment, subscribe, join the Discord, and I will catch you all next time. Also, I do apologise for the birds and any construction noises in the background. There is currently roadworks going on in front of my house. I can't stop them because I want that road fixed, and I'm just a random guy who will go and scream at them and then get arrested because it's roadworks. You can deal with it, it'll be fine. I'll put some funny music in the background.